Welcome, everyone, to the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center, where we bring the best of Christian scholarship to the church to help equip the saints to engage with the culture. My name is Anthony Costello, and on today's podcast, we're going to be talking about one of the great Christian thinkers in history, the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. Specifically, we're going to be taking a deep dive into Kierkegaard's unique views on the phenomenon of anxiety, perhaps a very relevant topic for us today. In order to do this, I've asked a new friend of mine, Brent Lyons, to join us. Brent is currently doing his PhD on Kierkegaard at the University of Oxford, and that's the Oxford over there in England. So you know it's legit. And yeah, Brent's been working on this topic for a while, and I had the good pleasure of meeting him last year at the Evangelical Philosophical Society's annual conference, where he was giving a paper on our topic today. So, Brent, welcome. This is our third or fourth take trying to get this done. Looks like it's going well so far, but thanks for joining us. And maybe before we get started on the topic itself, just introduce yourself for the audience and maybe give us a little bit of an idea about how you got interested and invested in this, in both Kierkegaard and then specifically this issue of anxiety.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, fourth time's a charm. Um, so for my background, the reason that I got into this topic is just a very personal reason. I was kind of very out of the blue, very profoundly just kind of stricken with anxiety. Beginning one day in 2005. Like I say, it was very sudden. It was sort of thing that I had felt maybe a few times in my life, going back to my childhood. But when this came up for me at this point in my life, it was sort of it just here's panic attacks were just starting, and then just kind of a generalized anxiety, and that was just my new life. And interestingly, up at that point in my life, as far as my who I was, my interests, my aims in life, I wasn't a Christian. I wasn't interested in religion, theology, philosophy. Wasn't really interested in thinking a whole lot about much more than just kind of the present moment. Not that not that there's not a place for that, but there is more to life. And so for sure, it was this kind of woke me up. A lot of people have had those moments where something has really shaken them and woken them up. For me, that was it. This new occurrence of having anxiety, panic attacks, was really kind of every few hours, panic attack.
Mm.
Wake up in the middle of the night, panic attack. Wake up in the morning, panic attack. Go to work, panic attack. And the most troubling thing about it for me at that time was that my life seemed fine. I was married, had been married for 5 years at that point, been working the same job for 5 years as a software developer. It's a great job, made a good living, had good community of friends, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing was wrong. And so it's like, what is this for? And just to kind of lead in to where we're going, I urgently needed answers to what in the world is going on because it's getting to the point where I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't work. I'm having to leave work earlier and earlier every day because I just can't function. And I'm seeking answers anywhere I can find an answer. And at this point in my life, I'm kind of like, well, if I want knowledge, then I should go to science. That's any knowledge worth having is going to be scientific,
Mhm.
and so that's kind of where I went. As a layperson, tried to get into neuroscience, evolutionary biology, psychology, anything I can find. And I've got this strong drive to figure this out. But I'm just not finding any answers that are very satisfactory. They're very surface level. A lot of this is, what you're experiencing is just really kind of vestigial, if you will. This was uh, adaptive behavior that was beneficial to us, millions of years ago.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm like, okay, well, what do I
What
do?
do I do now? Yeah.
And so that finally got me looking into older stuff, kind of first in philosophy, ultimately in world religions. And because, like I say, I'm like, I'll take whatever I can get. I don't care where I find it, as long as it can put me back together.
Hmm.
So I'll kind of pause there. That's the story of how I got into this topic. It
Okay.
was a very, yeah, urgent
So just
need.
an onset and ongoing sort of symptoms of just unexplainable. Obviously, you said there's a intellectual piece here where you're trying to think about what's going on,
Hmm.
like just like naturally you're curious as well as to why this is happening. Obviously, it's hurting your life, it's hurting your day-to-day lifestyle. Probably putting stress on your family situation and your work situation. So like any good researcher, then you're going to go figure out and find out what the problem is. With the hope of that, if you find the answer, that it'll actually turn into a real solution, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, so what happens then? How does Kierkegaard come into play here then? What happens?
So I think my full story is probably too long to tell in
Okay.
one interview, but I'll at least give the story of how I stumbled onto Kierkegaard, and kind of uh, we'll see how we want to lead into it, but maybe give a concrete example, which is in my life I've had many just, I mean, honestly amazing uh, experiences with anxiety, where I mean, by far the best things in my life came out of anxiety.
Hmm.
And that's not the story that we're told about anxiety. This is something to be rid of. For Kierkegaard, he would look at that completely different. And not only that, coming across Kierkegaard's work on anxiety, which is extremely developed, I mean, like surprisingly developed, um, it, it, it it made perfect sense of everything that I experienced with anxiety, because I had, like I say, very intriguing and really powerful experiences with it. So uh, I
Do you
guess
feel
where
like just let me interject here. A question just popped into my mind. Do you feel like so? Because I think you said in previous conversation there was just an essay that Kierkegaard wrote, right, called "What is Anxiety?" or
well, he
uh,
wrote a book called The
yeah,
Concept of
the
Anxiety.
concept of anxiety, and
Yeah.
you found that book
hmm
and read it. Do you prior to maybe discovering Kierkegaard's book on the topic? Did you feel like the anxiety and the panic attacks that you were having were being generative in some way, that they were leading to sort of positive outcomes? Or were you still in the mindset of this is just terrible? It's debilitating. I have to get rid of this somehow.
I would say yes.
Yes to
So
both?
both,
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
and
Like
and and
some
we
good
can get
things may
into
be
that.
coming out, but I still want to get this darn thing to go away.
Yeah, and so Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety is it. I'll start out by saying that it holds out an extraordinarily positive view of anxiety. In fact, I mean,
Mm.
he calls it the mark of perfection in a human being. And at the same time, he also does explain why it's not only understood so negatively, but felt so negatively. And this has to do with part of the subtitle of the concept of anxiety is, well, the subtitle is um, a dogmatic deliberate, a psychological deliberation on the dogma of hereditary sin. So it's a long subtitle, but the interesting part there is this part of what he calls hereditary sin,
Hmm.
and it's a very interesting take on sort of part, part of the human condition, you can say, or what we've received from Adam and Eve.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, he's connecting the psychological state of anxiety to this theological. concept of sin.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so
Which and we tried to mention it, another time. This is early 19th century
that's right.
when maybe the
Um,
discipline of psychology is sort of becoming into its own as an academic discipline. Of course, it's pre-Freudian, but it's it's becoming something other than just philosophy or theology.
that's exactly right. Yeah. And so this is a good lead into the life of Kierkegaard. So
Yeah.
this gives us a little bit of context. So in my dissertation, you know, I presented an earlier form of my dissertation to the then director of my program at Oxford, which is in philosophical theology, and his worry was, okay, you know, you're talking here about anxiety as Kierkegaard understood it.
Mhm.
You know, Kierkegaard also talks about despair. Um, so, so there's a sequel to the concept of anxiety called The Sickness Unto Death, which is also in my view, a masterpiece, very underappreciated. Um, but it's on the concept of despair, and and interestingly for Kierkegaard, sin is despair, because to despair is to assume that there is no possibility in your
Mhm.
life. But as uh, the as Mark tells us in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says, "For God, all things are possible." And so there's this interesting link for Kierkegaard between God and possibility. I'll kind of bracket that there for a second. The sort of the difficult part about sickness unto death is Kierkegaard is sort of understanding despair in a very different sense. You know, it's this is sin. It can
Mhm.
be a very silent thing. Kierkegaard talks about despair as uh, leading to the loss of oneself, and that can happen as quietly uh, as anything else in the world. It's very dangerous. But today, in psychological context, we talk about despair as a very, like phenomenologically rich thing. It's something that's, very powerfully felt. And for Kierkegaard, it can be a very silent thing. And so
Oh, I see.
the director of my program is like, have it, how can we have any confidence that the anxiety that Kierkegaard is talking about is anything like what we talk about today in
Today.
psychology?
So he's thinking it wouldn't be relevant to our contemporary context.
That's the concern. Yeah.
Yeah.
This turns out to be it turns out to be a very interesting question because so basically at the time that Kierkegaard is um, studying for what would be kind of like our PhD today, it was a
Mhm.
magister back then. Um, but he would have had to have taken so he studied at the U University of Copenhagen. Um, he would have had to have taken quite a lot actually of psychology classes. And so there's this kind of critique about thinkers in the early 19th century that, or before, that when they talk about psychology, they're talking about something like ancient Greek philosophy of the soul.
Right. The metaphysics of the soul and
Right,
something. Yeah.
right. Yeah, and before his age, there is definitely some truth to that. Um, uh, but at the time that Kierkegaard is studying, what's interesting is there is this sort of like global, not global, but in the West anyway, this large scale shift of particularly the discipline of psychology from more of a philosophical discipline to more of a biological discipline.
Mm.
And so um, it turns out you kind of look at the books that Kierkegaard had not only to read but to master for his final examination. And these books are books about biology.
Yeah.
In fact, he kind of complains in his private journals that um, that psychology is taking this really kind of radical, empirical, objective turn
Hmm.
that kind of concerns him. He kind of quips. He's like, we might as well talk about how many inches of sin there are in Copenhagen today.
Right. So it's
So
this sort of physicalist turn, as we say in
yeah,
contemporary lingo, towards everything being of a physical nature, and then there only being physical causes to things, and
right,
sort of
right,
removing the whole. first person experience, the what it's
Exactly.
likeness of things. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's one of Kierkegaard's big overall objectives with Christianity is
Mm.
this turn to objectivity within Christianity and this turn toward abstract thought and mere philosophizing and no action. This is something that Bonhoeffer would pick up, and Bonhoeffer terms it cheap grace. That when you're called into the kingdom, when you're called to follow Christ, it's very expensive. It's not a cheap thing. You don't, you know, sit around and navel gaze,
Yeah.
which
Yeah. Because the Christianity or the cultural Christianity he's living in is probably someone would say, to put it one way, like just an intellectual assent to certain theological propositions,
that's right.
as opposed to a religious, and I'm using that in the sense of the devotional, the
Yeah,
spirit, spiritual side, the religious component is missing, right?
correct.
The
Yeah,
changed life, the transformation of the person through the realities that the propositions are supposedly pointing to, right?
correct.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think that Kierkegaard is has a similar worry within the discipline of psychology.
Mm.
He doesn't seem to be against all empirical study or anything like that.
Yeah.
But like you say, there's this danger of over objectifying things to the point where you've lost the subjective experience that is needed to understand a person's psychological states.
So he's seeing sort of like the reductionistic turn,
For sure,
right?
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So all that to say, I don't think that in Kierkegaard's day, I don't think that the psychological context is all that far removed from what it is today. And even with all this, even with this turn that is clearly evident at that time, and like I say, so there were a few universities in the West that were largely responsible for this shift. I think the Sorbonne was another kind of big pillar. But the University of Copenhagen was sort of one of the pillars in this move of psychology from a philosophical discipline to a more empirical, objective one. Um, so yeah, and even with all that, Kierkegaard loved his studies in psychology, and in fact, he dedicates the book, The Concept of Anxiety, to his favorite professor at the University of Copenhagen, who was not in the theology department or the philosophy department, but was a professor of psychology.
Hmm.
So it's interesting. There is uh, uh, to sum up, I think we can have a good degree of confidence that what Kierkegaard is talking about when he refers to anxiety is very much like what we discussed today. I think I can kind of say that from an academic standpoint, and then just from an anecdotal standpoint, whatever it was that I was experiencing,
Hmm.
which was easily identified by a number of counselors and psychologists as anxiety, coming across this book, like I say, explained uh, so much more in such greater depth, in
Depth.
such greater
Yeah.
scope,
Yeah.
exactly what I was going through. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just like so
And
anecdotally,
was that
I
that was
think
still before you were Christian, as well? I mean,
that's right.
there was a sense in your life where Kierkegaard opens the door to Christian faith itself? Is that how it went?
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm uh, now a Christian, and a huge reason for that is Kierkegaard.
And you're not the only person I've met who's got that kind of story, or at least that part of it there, that in reading Kierkegaard, it just sort of opened Christianity up to them in a way that they hadn't thought about before. And then they went on to become Christians. It's very interesting. I mean, I've been teaching through Peter Kreeft's little introduction to philosophy, the 4 volume Socrates
Hmm.
Children. And
Yeah.
in volume, I think Kierkegaard is mentioned in volume 3, maybe 4, but I think 3. He talks about Kierkegaard as the greatest Protestant thinker of all time. Of course, Kreeft's a Catholic, so he doesn't want to give Luther or Calvin any credit or anything like
Right.
that, but he picks Kierkegaard as the greatest Protestant thinker in the history of Christian thought. So,
I didn't
uh,
know that. That's pretty amazing.
yeah, yeah. So it's a nice dedication for sure. Um, okay, so that yeah, and so it is relevant, and also I think we talked at one point offline about well, if Christianity is true, and a lot of a more theological approach is going to maybe give us a richer and fuller description of the phenomenon, right,
Yes. Yeah.
itself. And then we do see, I think, especially in the last 20, 25 years, and we think of certain online personalities like I think we mentioned Jordan Peterson or others. People are interested again in not to call Kierkegaard ancient wisdom, but there is a sense of we've lost knowledge that, previous generations had because we took this, or at least a
Yeah.
portion of the West took this more reductionistic turn. And maybe
hmm
it's time to recapture uh, some prior wisdom, right?
Yeah.
But that
Yes.
that is sort of a, intellectual vibe shift I think that we've experienced just in the last couple of years as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. And that's actually the initial my initial introduction to Kierkegaard came from reading Thomas Oden's Systematic Theology.
Yes,
That's
yes, which is a great systematic theology book. Yeah,
Yeah, and I can't remember if we talked about this online or during one of our
yeah,
other attempts at this, but so Odin has now it's called Classic Christianity. At the time that I had it, it was a three-volume series called Systematic Theology. And one of the things that I just found fascinating about the systematic theology is that Odin states that his aim in this whole series is to remain as unoriginal as possible.
yep. To do nothing
And
novel. Yeah,
exactly, yeah,
exactly.
and to just let the ancient thinkers speak for themselves.
Right.
And so, because I was getting to this point where I was like I was just finding more and more wisdom in the ancients, which was just like you say, man, that was just a paradigm shift for me where I thought the newer, the better, the more scientific, the better. And here it's like I'm going further and further back, more and more into philosophy, and the more and more not just wisdom that I'm finding, but kind of like answers to the things that I'm looking for finally. And so but one of the things that was fascinating about Thomas Oden's systematic theology is, it's largely drawing from scripture first on different areas of systematic theology, but then also um, sort of explored further with the great thinkers of the church like Augustine, Athanasius,
Yeah.
Anselm, Aquinas, Irenaeus, so on and so forth. And so you've got these typical thinkers of ancient thinkers of the church, and then you'll have Kierkegaard thrown in the mix.
Yeah. 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 Right.
And I'm kind of like really
And I think
taken
like
aback
one
by
or
that.
two references to Plantinga. Like there are like
Yeah,
one maybe two.
there is.
But
Yeah,
yeah, but
right.
Kierkegaard makes several appearances in that
He's in
book.
there quite a
Yeah.
lot. And I'm like, almost a little bit offended, because I'm developing this like deep reverence for the ancient thinkers, but here's this 19th century guy, and what's he
Yeah.
doing in here? And so but it turns out I think that it's perfectly fitting.
Mhm.
I do agree with Kraft. He is
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
of the greatest and one of the greatest thinkers in Christianity, and I think especially in the case of anxiety, he this one of the things that's a little bit frustrating for me is that I think that the church has this amazing heritage here in Kierkegaard, especially when it comes to anxiety, that nobody's talking about. And this kind of belongs to the church. This is, you know, it is a Christ-centered view. And it's just a horribly rich, and positive and such a helpful view that I think the church just needs to rediscover, like you say.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I had this growing sense over the last 2 years as I'm just reading history of philosophy series is over and over like I did C. Stephen Evans's Then I did Crafts. Now I'm in Copleston.
Mm.
That, if there are two philosophers, Christian philosophers that I think need to be sort of recaptured in the realm of philosophy of religion. And we're seeing it with your paper, and there were other Kierkegaard papers the last 2 years. It was
Mm.
Kierkegaard and Pascal, right?
Yep.
Who are outliers in a sense,
Yep.
because they really are philosophers who take the subjective seriously. They're equally as sort of like devotional, I won't call it mystical per se, but as they are capable of doing abstract, speculative, metaphysical thinking. I mean, Kierkegaard
Hmm.
can challenge Hegel and this and that,
Hmm.
but they're doing stuff that is just really relevant to the individual,
Yeah.
and the way we experience life and the Christian life as well. So yeah, that's good. I could go on about Odin's book too. Yeah, that's such a good. That's the one I use when I teach doctrine. I
Good
just
for
go to
you.
that one because not only can you get, just a little side note for anybody out there who wants to teach at church, not only do you get, uh, can you teach through the doctrines, but then you're giving basically a church history class at the same time.
Yep.
So
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's a great book. All right, so let's get into then specifically now the view on anxiety. So
Yeah.
walk us through. Uh, you mentioned at the beginning, Kierkegaard sees this as a perfection of sorts.
Yeah.
So it's an utterly positive thing for Kierkegaard. Like that, for most people talking about thinking about anxiety in contemporary psychological or mental health terms, that's going to sound very counterintuitive, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah, of course. And so and I would love to kind of bracket for just a little bit later. That still needs explaining. Just at the outset, it's kind of like how could somebody talk about anxiety as such a positive thing when it feels like such a negative thing?
Mm.
And so, of course, when you and I met at the EPS, the paper that I was giving was addressing that question. And so I would love to bracket that. And once we've kind of explored Kierkegaard's fundamentally positive view, it would be good to come back to
Yeah,
that.
that's it. Okay.
Um, so if I can, yeah, I would love to kind of lay out Kierkegaard's view as I understand it, and then maybe kind of follow that up with a one of uh, one of what are several examples in my own life, where this is just played out exactly as Kierkegaard describes it. So yeah, so Kierkegaard begins in the concept of anxiety by making a distinction. And so he says, anxiety kind of, it feels like fear and worry, but it's fundamentally different. Anxiety is fundamentally different than fear and worry. And how's that? Well, the way he kind of explains it is, and I'll kind of pause here before we really dive in. One of the interesting things, and I suspect one of the reasons that I was that I was accepted into study at Oxford is, interestingly, you kind of look. So the concept of anxiety, the book itself, is a very philosophically dense book. In fact, there's a very well-known Kierkegaard scholar, Gordon Marino, who in his commentary on concept of anxiety suggests, and he is dead serious when he says this, um, that he doesn't think that Kierkegaard meant for the book to be intelligible. He thought it was only meant to bring the reader anxiety because it's not understandable.
Well,
So that
I
gives you
I
an
tell
idea.
you, I tell you that maybe that's the goal of most of the Frankfurt School philosophers that I've read over the
Right.
years too, is just to cause
Right.
anxiety because
Oh,
I
right.
mean, I like some of these Hegelians are just seem to be intentionally unintelligible.
Right, right.
Struggle to think that Kierkegaard was doing, but if he was doing it, that's funny. That would be interesting.
Um, but I didn't ever read any commentaries on the concept of anxiety until I got to Oxford, and this is well after I become a Christian, well after I've come across
Mm.
Kierkegaard, well after I've got this deep new understanding of anxiety. for me, I read the book again. I was in, such a kind of urgent turmoil
Mm.
that I would just kind of like just plow through anything I could get my hands on. For me, yeah, it was dense, but at the same time, it made perfect sense. And so
Interesting.
yeah, and so this is all to say that, you read a commentary on the concept of anxiety, and it's just almost the opposite of my experience of reading it, and the way that I understand it, and the way that that understanding has like just truly changed my life.
Mm.
So uh so um so the distinction that Kierkegaard begins with uh between anxiety and fear and worry.
Yeah.
So he kind of, and this is kind of my I'm adding a little bit here to Kierkegaard's words, but um, what he says is that anxiety is fundamentally different from fear and worry in that fear and worry have definite objects. This is what he
Yeah.
says. The way that I understand this, which I mean, I think is pretty simple, it's kind of like, if you're out hiking and a bear jumps out in front of you, you're obviously afraid of the bear.
Mhm.
So there's an object of your emotion here. You have this intense emotion of fear, and it's very obvious what the object is. It's the bear.
Yeah.
So there's an intentional object behind that feeling, and you know what that object is. Or likewise with worry, if I have a speech to give tomorrow in front of 50,000 people, then I might be worried about my speech. So
Hmm.
same deal. There's an intentional object behind my worry,
Yeah.
and I know exactly what that is. Um, However, with anxiety, he says he calls anxiety this his words an alien power that grips the individual.
Mm.
So for him, it's this powerful feeling that arises out of nowhere, and it seems to have no object. And again, like I was saying earlier, this is one of the more terrifying things about anxiety, especially when life seems to be going just fine.
Yeah, it still can emerge regardless of what arrangement you are currently living in life. Could be the best, like a great arrangement of things. There's nothing in particular that you're afraid of or worried about, but all of a
Right,
sudden, right,
right, yeah.
it comes over you.
Yeah. And again, for me, I find this one of the most fascinating things about this particular human phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating, and there's not a lot of explanation, that you can find about why it is that happens. But to me, Kierkegaard's understanding is just brilliant. So what he says is that fear and worry are about actuality. So again, there's an intentional object. You know what that object is. So if you want to say there's intentional actuality, there's epistemic actuality. In other words, there's an actual object.
Mhm.
Um, but he says that with anxiety, that actuality is not there. And he goes a little bit into a philosophical analysis about how do we then cash out anxiety, and his conclusion essentially is anxiety can't be about actuality, and if it's not about actuality, it has to be about possibility.
Mm. Okay.
And so, the first time that I read this, I'm like, yeah, I could go along with that. That seems natural enough so far. But the big kicker is where he essentially says, and again, this is my understanding here of the concept of anxiety. Um, he kind of asks this question, or invites the reader to ask, suppose that God is offering you a new life. Suppose that God is inviting you to a better life. Suppose that you're in this life where, as comfortable as it may be, maybe your possibilities have sort of dwindled, and you're kind of living in mediocrity. Uh, this is often the place where God will invite you to a new life. And well, what is a new life? Well, it's just an explosion of new possibilities. Again, we could at least talk from the point of view of Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard thinks that, again, going back to the Gospel of Mark, for God all things are possible. For man, certain things are impossible. For God, all things are possible. Um, so for Kierkegaard, possibility is kind of like this divine quality. Um, and so his thought is that when anxiety kind of shows up out of nowhere, what it what it means is that you've somehow stumbled onto a kind of a divine idea in the mind of God for a
Mm.
new life. Um, and so for those that haven't experienced a kind of profound anxiety, this might sound like an interesting, philosophical theory. But for myself, just to give, I can give a couple of examples, I guess. So I'll sort of fast forward to the point where I had come across Kierkegaard, and this is later on in life, 2008, 2007. Uh, Anxiety has shown up again.
Hmm.
Same deal. Every 3 hours, I'm having a panic attack. Uh, Wake up in the middle of the night, panic attack. Wake up in the morning, panic attack, et cetera, et cetera. But at this point, I am sort of for the first time with anxiety, approaching it the way that Kierkegaard suggests I approach it, which is sort of to begin using your religious imagination, if you will,
Mm.
and begin wondering what might it be that God is inviting me to. Um, in this, in a theological context, a new life could be salvation. It could be sanctification. It could be some sort of mission, character remediation, uh, adventure, whatever it is, it's something positively good if it is from God.
Mm.
And so I'm at this point in my life just sort of on the lookout for what might God be inviting me to, and I kind of try on new like life orientations, if you will. I'm kind of oriented this particular way in my life. These are the people in my life. This is where my life is going. This is where I'm working. This is where I see my life headed, et cetera, et cetera. And sort of this point of tension is when God is calling you to something very different. Um,
Mm. That you
and
can't, the anxiety opens up the possibility for you to, oh, the anxiety opens you up to the possibilities,
yeah,
possibilities that you otherwise, if you not did not have the anxiety,
yeah,
would not realize or recognize
they'd never
or
cross your mind. Yeah,
identify. Yeah.
right. Yeah, absolutely. And so at this point in my life, I'm just kind of on the lookout, and considering different lives. Positive. What sort of like positive life changes could I make? And uh, the other thing that Kierkegaard says is that anxiety is kind of like walking up to the edge of a cliff, and you look out over this cliff, and there's just this abyss of God's possibility. And it's kind of like you look down at the edge of a cliff, and you get this kind of vertigo or dizziness. And
Mm.
this is one of his famous lines from the book, where he says that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And
Yes.
that's taken in very different ways than the way that I think Kierkegaard intended it. A lot of interpretations will sort of be like, what Kierkegaard meant is that you look out and see all the different uh, possibilities that you can do, all the different this very wide variety of free choices that you could make. Whereas for Kierkegaard, it's really, I think, painstakingly obvious that possibility is something that God offers. Um,
Okay. Okay. Which makes a qualitative difference then about how, yeah, because one thing as we were talking about here, and I was recollecting, a couple months ago, I went through a lot of Peter Berger's corpus. All right, several of his works. He was a sociologist of religion, and he talks about hereses, but and uses it in the as a unique a problem unique to modernity. and hereditary means choice, right? You
Okay.
in modernity, in maybe what we'd call whoever came up with that acronym, the Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic, technologically advanced, weird nation. Um, you know, this the mind is presented with all these possibilities, right? All these choices that you can make in your life. Even it gets encapsulated this. You can be whatever you want if you just dream big enough
Right.
or whatever.
Right. Right.
Which is an obvious falsehood, but there is like it's not like we're living in a culture anymore where my dad was a potato farmer, my grandfather was a potato farmer, so I'm going to be a potato farmer, and this is just what we do, and I don't have to think much about it. I don't have to be confronted with what Berger calls the abundance of choice.
Yeah.
That is maybe more unique to modern man. But this
Hmm.
abundance of choice is anxiety inducing
Yeah. Hmm.
because you have you don't know, you don't have knowledge
Hmm.
of which choice to make.
Hmm.
And if you make one, you'll always have the thought redounding through your mind that maybe you didn't pick the right one and you should have picked the other one,
Hmm.
right? And then maybe you switch, and then you go the other route and you do that, but then and I'd almost say like a good portion of my life has actually felt like that
Uh-huh.
kind of anxiety. Um, but that's not what Kierkegaard is saying when you approach the abyss and you look out. Maybe he is if some people are maybe the interpreters are saying are thinking that it is kind of this realm of human choices.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
which would be in a sense panic inducing.
Right.
Could be. But that's not what Kierkegaard is saying. This is sort of like divine possibilities. So there's an agent, there's God on the other end of this.
Exactly.
It's more of a revelation of possibilities. Right.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and I'll just read a couple of quotes here from
Yeah.
from Kierkegaard, and I could easily read probably 30 minutes of them because he actually talks about possibility extraordinarily often throughout really all of his works, and with the exception of what he would call the aesthetic sphere, which is something that he um, I don't want to say condemns, but this is a very low form of life for Kierkegaard,
Yes. Right.
um, where the aesthete just lives for momentary pleasure.
Mhm.
The cardinal sin for the aesthete is boredom, and the cardinal virtue is arbitrariness. And basically just
Right.
conjuring up as many possibilities as you can. For Kierkegaard, there's a Danish word he uses for that, which is called "det fantastiske," which is the fantastic.
Yes.
And for Kierkegaard, this constant need to devise more and more of your own possibilities, that's how you lose yourself. That's what leads to despair. So this is another reason why this can't be the right interpretation, I don't think, of
Mhm.
what Kierkegaard means by, um, I mean, Kierkegaard says himself that the purpose of anxiety is to be educated into faith. So it can't be reliance on one's own possibilities.
Right.
And so just a couple of quick passages from Kierkegaard. Um, so this is from Works of Love, which is a beautiful book. Highly recommend that. It's really just kind of a meditation on the scriptures. But he says, God, in the proper sense, continually assigns possibility just a small part at a time. By means of the possible, eternity, which is God, is continually near enough to be available and yet distant enough to keep the human being in motion forward toward the eternal, to keep him going forward. This is how eternity or God lures and draws a person in impossibility from the cradle to the grave, provided he chooses to hope. Um, so here, obviously, possibility is something that God assigns and kind of places in front of us as it's an interesting word that Kierkegaard uses, a lure to
Mm.
draw us in. We sort
Right.
of see these possibilities. This is how we follow, and God is not so close that we won't progress, and in Christ likeness, but uh, but yet far enough away to keep us going forward. Um, and then one of the passages. This is from Kierkegaard's personal journal. Um, and he's talking here about this notion that with God all things are possible, and of course Kierkegaard doesn't understand this in a divine voluntarist way, where God, God can make a square circle.
Right, right.
But
Not
this is
talking
a
about like logical impossibilities cannot be
right.
possible or something, but yeah.
But this is a very existential, and meaning uh, are applicable to our relationship with God. Um,
Mm,
what he says is this thought that all things are possible with God is now in the deepest sense my watchword and has gained a meaning for me which I had never envisioned. Just because I see no way out, I must never have the audacity to say that therefore there is none for God. For it is despair and blasphemy to confuse one's own little crumb of imagination with the possibilities that God has at his disposal. So these are just a couple of examples where it's very clear, and I think, I mean, this is a very interesting passage from his own journals where he's stating this idea about possibility has become the most important thing in the world to me. Um,
mm,
and part of what he's saying also is, um, he sort of says that you come to the edge of the cliff, you see God's possibility, and it causes the dizziness of freedom. And of course, what Kierkegaard means by freedom, this is a very Augustinian idea, and to an extent Lutheran idea, that freedom is not clutching to your own choice, your own capacities. In fact, Kierkegaard says this dizziness will cause you to kind of spiritually faint, if you will, or swoon. That's
mm,
the translation. But uh, and if you clutch for finiteness, for finite
mhm.
things in that moment, you arise guilty. And so once again, uh, I think he can't be talking about human possibilities here. He must be talking about divine possibilities. What he says is, if you if you kind of leap into the abyss of God's possibilities,
Mhm.
trusting that God will carry you, he says you then arise lighter than every finite thing in the world. You arise in freedom. Um,
Yeah, so I mean, it's just reminding me of, and I always forget where this is, but when Paul says it was for freedom um, that Christ set us free. Like what are
yeah,
we set free for? For freedom. This
right.
guy's just like, I think it's in Colossians or Galatians, one or the other, but yeah, it was for
Yeah,
freedom that you've been set free. Like, like
right.
that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Like it's for an infinite number of possibilities within the nature of God, right?
Hmm.
I mean, this seems to relate to the divine attribute, we said the divine attribute of God's infinity, God being infinite in nature. Um, Obviously then the possibilities in our, if we say in our, as we can and might relate to God,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, so there's a very different aim, and it's a very important distinction. For Kierkegaard, possibility is not it's not merely a human capacity. It is a human capacity, but in the final and important and fundamental sense, for Kierkegaard, anxiety is kind of it's aimed at God and
that's
God's
a God
possibilities.
centered
Yeah.
uh,
Um,
thing. Yeah.
okay, and so
So just to, put the point on it, it's not, oh, I could be a doctor, I could be a lawyer, I could be,
right.
it's not just that, right? It's now there may be things included in a divine possibility, maybe that are are finite goods,
Yeah,
right?
sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And so really the way that I kind of have started to look at it is more kind of, I mean, this is maybe a cheesy and cliche example, but I do really kind of see this as so Kierkegaard calls possibility the border of the wondrous. And this is the way that I take that. It's kind of like uh, this is my cheesy example, kind of like looking at a mountain range, and
Mhm.
you sort of see these peaks, and some are a little bit farther off than others. Um, but you can, and so far off, you can't make out exactly the detail of what's going on in the mountain, but you can see that. sort of sharp that sharp line between the mountain, the shape of the mountain peaks, and the background of the sky,
Hmm.
and that sort of sharp distinguishing line, I think, is possibility. It's
Mm.
almost like a what some philosophers would call like a supervenient property. So here's a life that God is offering you. Um, and in my own experience, it's been very obvious and quite distinct what God has called me to. And I'll get into some of those examples. Uh, but in those times, it's kind of like a general direction. Oh, this I clearly know what I need to start going toward. I have no idea where this is all going to lead. I don't know the details of this. I'm going to have to trust God on this.
Well, yeah, okay, so that's interesting because if it's not just this realm of human possibilities, it's possible things that we could conceive of that give us this abundance of choices, which could be anxiety inducing. But we're talking about divine possibility, God opening up new life in God,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
The anxiety sort of leads us to that, right?
Yeah.
It's the anxiety is there for that reason, to
Exactly.
get us to sort of see that, right?
Absolutely.
To
Yeah.
get us to be aware of this, spiritual possibilities in our relationship, in our activity, in our engagement with God, and with His offering to us, what He's offering to us, given who we are, given not just what kind of creatures are, but what kind of individuals we are, right?
Hmm.
Maybe even
Yep.
like my personal psychology, my personal background, right? God knows
Yep.
each one of us, right, by name, um, and even has new names for us in heaven.
Hmm.
Um, so given that, then, but what we don't have is knowledge of how this all is going to play out,
Yeah.
right? We don't have that kind of knowledge, and then because I keep thinking a faith component
Yep.
trust and believe, right? There's no other way. That a faith component is also in here for Kierkegaard. Here's these possibilities with God, but it's not like he tells us everything. So we were talking about the wilderness wanderings earlier offline of the
Yeah.
Israelites.
Yeah.
So the possibilities are there. We get a sort of maybe like a sense of this, right? But then to actualize the possibility,
Yeah.
right? Would you say then this is where we would talk about the exercising of faith, right?
Yes.
There we have
Yeah.
to exercise faith
Yeah.
because God's not giving us the whole picture, but He is making us aware that there is a picture,
Yes.
kind
Yeah.
of.
So again, it is definitely a wake up call.
Yeah.
I think it's a spiritual wake up call. For me, I really do see it as anxiety as a kind of spiritual seeing, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so to give a couple of examples, as I promised,
Yep.
well, maybe I'll just give the example of um, somewhat more recent example. So in 2015, so anxiety is back in full force. I hadn't had anxiety at this point for about 8 years. Um, Panic attacks every three hours. Wake up in the middle of the night, panic attack. Wake up in the morning, panic attack, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and one day I'm at a cafe and uh, kind of accidentally online. This is a couple of weeks into this anxiety. But like I say, I mean, I'm on the lookout for anything that God might be offering, any kind of invitation. Um, and by the way, each time that I have experienced anxiety, it's I've been able to move quicker and quicker, if you will. So about 2 weeks into my anxiety here, um, and to me, anxiety has become, in a sense, very exciting. And here's an example why. So, I'm at a cafe one day here in Portland where I live, and kind of accidentally come across this program at the University of Oxford in philosophical theology. This was a MPhil in philosophical theology, and when I when I discover that when I come across this program, I mean like, and this is the third time that this has happened to me at this point in my life. My anxiety just physically leaves. Um, this is my experience with it. I
Hmm.
mean, it is gone as if I've never experienced it before. Um, and I know exactly what that means. But I'm looking at, to me, it's just again for someone that has had this kind of profound anxiety, right in front of your nose every waking moment of your life, to go from that to it just being gone
Gone.
is, I mean, I can't explain how profound that is. Um, and it's also, as I've been told many times, anxiety doesn't work like that. But that's my experience with anxiety.
But by counselors and sort of the
Yeah.
more the modern or the contemporary take on what anxiety is supposed to be like, right?
Yes, exactly. And
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm happy to go into some of these other stories. So one of the things that Kierkegaard says is you're standing at the edge of the cliff and you have two options here. You can recoil in fear and run, and or grasp for something finite. But both of these things are the wrong move. The move again is to just lean into God, God's possibility, and trust Him to carry you. Um, and what he says is that requires this leap. Um, Often there's a saying that's misattributed to Kierkegaard called the leap of faith.
Hmm.
Kierkegaard actually never wrote that, but it does capture, I think, what he's trying to get at anyway. Um, and what he says is that the leap into God's possibility is what he calls a leap into the absurd. Um, but so Kierkegaard was also a tutor of Latin, and interestingly, the word absurd, and this was something that my supervisor brought to my attention. Um, ab means in Latin, it means from,
Hmm. Yep.
and uh,
Sordus. Uh,
means deaf, or silence.
Okay.
So
Okay.
a- absurd literally means in the Latin from silence. So and there's a lot of
Mhm.
meanings here, but a lot of especially what Kierkegaard I think is getting at is that this leap into God's possibility, sort of by definition, like you said, it will involve your psychology, your character, et cetera, et cetera. But whatever God is calling you into is something that you won't be able to do on your own accord or of
Yeah.
your own capacities.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And so this is a big point for Kierkegaard. And it's just one more reason why it makes so much sense of my experience with it. So I'm looking into this infill in philosophical theology, and like I say, with how profound of an experience this is for your anxiety to go from being right in front of your nose to just being gone. I know exactly what I have to do, which is apply to this program. But so, I'm immediately looking into uh, what are the requirements really even to apply.
Mhm.
And just a few of them, you need a 3.75 GPA minimum, and they don't use these terms, but basically an Ivy League school, if you're an American,
Yeah.
in philosophy or theology. And my undergrad was a 3.1 from Texas Tech in computer science. So,
Yeah,
and-
Oxford material right there.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so and funny enough, I mean, that is my first reaction. This is
Yeah.
absurd.
Like this is
Um,
from I'm jumping from the silence. I have
yeah.
nothing to say. I can't make.
Well, this is not coming
Yeah.
from me.
Yeah.
And
That's right. That's fun. That's interesting. Okay.
and so the short of it, again, there is much more to the story. There
Mhm.
are really, really crazy, what I would easily call miracles happening throughout this whole period, and that's been my experience with anxiety as well. Just a very clear signs of God working in my life,
Mm.
and even moreover, just a very strong closeness with God during these times. But that definitely requires at least a reconceptualization uh, of anxiety as pointing to
Yeah.
God. And so, fast forwarding through a lot of the story, the short of it is that I applied, talked to the director at the time, and he said, "There's no way you can't, you won't get in." The director of the program told me this. Essentially, I couldn't. The longer that I waited, the sort of the worse the anxiety was getting, to the point where I was like, I just have to apply, regardless of what the director has told me. And he was like, maybe you could try getting a master's somewhere else first, et cetera, et cetera. Um, the short of it is that I applied. Oh, one other uh, note about this program. I was like, well, maybe this is the sort of program where they allow like 400 or 500 students in every year, and so
Right.
I
Maybe I have a chance. Yeah.
look into the statistics, and which they publish online. And that year anyway, they said on average we accept between 3 and 4 students a year.
This is
So
good. This is a good story. This is making it very, yeah.
so
Yeah.
talk about
The
absurd.
impossible is becoming possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, and um, yeah. And so I even I run
Mm. Mm.
a philosophy, what I call philosophy pub night,
Yeah.
which
I'm
is
gonna
for
try and join you one night.
would
Yeah.
love to have
You
you.
can zoom me in.
Absolutely. Yes. Which is mostly, it's a very wide variety of viewpoints, and it's kind of a philosophy of religion group,
Mhm.
but it's mostly non-Christians. And interestingly, at that time, before I applied, I kind of predicted for everybody, if you will. I told everybody, I guarantee you all I'm getting in to Oxford, to this program that allows 3 or 4 students a year, and there is absolutely no way that I should get in.
Mm.
Um,
Wow.
but they
So
knew
you made a
my
prediction
I did, yeah,
in
and
faith. Yeah.
they knew my view of anxiety, and I was like, I'm here. Let's see if the rubber meets the road here. Um, and anyway, long story short, applied, no questions asked, got right in.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and
Awesome. Amazing.
I told this story to
Yeah.
my dissertation supervisor one evening in his office at Oxford, and so I was trying to tell him that this is not just like an intellectual curiosity for me.
Yeah.
This is my
Right.
life. And he asked, what did I mean? And so I told him the story, and he said, I'm usually on the decisioning committee for who makes it into this program every year. And the year that you applied, I wasn't part of the committee. And he said, so I don't know how you got in, but you're right. You definitely shouldn't have. Um, I'm glad you did, but I have no idea how you
How it
got in.
happened. Right. Yeah.
So this is this is
Anomaly. Anomaly.
yeah. So this is
Yeah.
one of many stories that I've had with anxiety, and in every occasion, by far, the biggest and most amazing things have happened in my life, and they've all been completely inexplicable, um, outside of Kierkegaard's view of anxiety.
Well, no, this is, I mean, because I mean, it's good. And I didn't know that story until you just told it now. Because, it's like you want to people to be aware of this
Yeah,
understanding that he had, because it seems to be, what's the truth,
right.
tracking, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, like, if he's got some spiritual insight
Yeah,
that he's communicating, that God has communicated to him in lieu of his reading of the scriptures,
yeah,
and you know God places him at a certain time, a certain place, with a certain kind of mind to kind of come up with these ideas, and it really makes sense. And then
it does.
it's
Yeah,
applicable. Like you just gave this is not just in the philosophy book. It's like, oh, I have these experiences. Here's a very particular case of one time when it happened, and here's how it played out. And I didn't have to do this thing where I started getting anxious about my anxiety,
Right. Right.
which is, as you said, the despair. The
Hmm.
despair part would be that we don't to not see. And maybe this is just saying like we need to see everything in a theocentric
Yeah.
light.
Yeah.
All of our experiences, everything phenomena, our mental states, our moods, our emotions.
Hmm.
We should maybe as Christians we should already be thinking like what is God doing here? How is this how should this be turning me towards God
Hmm.
and what God wants, what God desires, what God can do.
Hmm.
And and he focused in on this one very common and universal phenomenon of anxiety,
Yeah.
right? And so I mean it's very pastoral. I think
Yeah.
this is super relevant to our pastoral care and counseling
Yeah.
and because we know like we're living in anxious times, and I think maybe in two senses because of
Hmm.
that problem of modernity that we're
Hmm.
still surrounded with. But so yeah, it's a real recasting of the whole idea and phenomenon and experience of anxiety
Absolutely.
in a redemptive way, right? I mean,
Right.
this is redemption that we're talking about. Things
Yes.
that seem negative, this is the whole problem of evil, seem negative, but the great God pulls out the greater good, which reminds us also of the teleological suspension of the ethical, right?
Right.
As well,
Yeah.
perhaps. No,
Yeah.
that's awesome. That's awesome.
Um,
Um, so I kind of almost want to end on that story because it's so right there and concrete, and this is what happened, and it's real, right? So we're not just talking abstract philosophy. I did want to touch on though the phenomenon of the mood, I don't know, the mood of anxiety as how it relates to meaning. You had something in the paper there on meaning and how mood and meaning relate. So I don't know if you want to expound on that a little bit as well.
yeah. And I wonder, I'll leave this to you, which order
Yeah.
we want to do this. But there is also, like I say, there's still something to address. You sort of leave the story here, and there's still some kind of dangling worries, which are, like I say, if anxiety is so fundamentally positively aimed,
Mhm.
why do we feel it so negative? Why do we
So
understand
negatively.
it so
Yeah,
negatively?
well,
Yeah.
okay, let's address that then.
Um,
Talk
it,
about this. Yeah.
yeah, and then I think this will tie in
Yeah.
nicely with mood and meaning.
Okay. Yeah.
Uh, yeah. So Kierkegaard again. So he has these, extremely positive things to say about anxiety. Like I say, he says the one who has understood anxiety rightly has gained eternity, has gained the ultimate. Um, Anxiety is the mark of perfection in a person because it's the meeting point, if you will, between a person and God. Um, uh, and so he has these grand superlatives about anxiety. And so just to give a little personal spin on this, the day before uh, I wrote a thesis in my MPhil at Oxford on this. And the day before I turned it in, I'm kind of trying to anticipate, uh, pushback on different readings of Kierkegaard. How might a critic respond to this, et cetera, et cetera. And then I came across this passage that I kind of glossed over every time that I read it in Concept of Anxiety because it seemed incongruent with my understanding. And it's a passage where Kierkegaard says anxiety is of all things the most selfish. And so I'm like, I don't know what to make of that. I've just kind of brushed it to the side as an aberration. But I was like, I have to deal with that because this doesn't make sense on my reading. And sort of then the more that I pulled on that thread, the more that this whole other story unfolded that I never saw. And this was, I don't know, probably my 10th time reading the book. Um, and like I say, part of the subtitle of the book is on what Kierkegaard calls hereditary sin. Um, and again, like I never looked at that because initially I'm like, I need help. And oh, here's this weird stuff about this, vague Christian idea of original sin. And initially coming into it, I was like, I just need help with my anxiety. I don't really care about these theological doctrines and
Mm,
stuff.
right.
But here now I'm having to deal with it, as a as a student in philosophical theology. Um, and so what I then discover is something just fascinating and not again, it's not just a philosophical or theological curiosity. It's something that makes a lot of sense of I think especially our age of anxiety. Um, and so this is my reading of Kierkegaard here, but the story goes like this, as I understand it. So Kierkegaard begins by talking about how Adam and Eve in the garden before the fall would have still experienced anxiety, and that would make sense if anxiety is a fundamentally positive and God-aimed thing.
Hmm.
I mean,
And they have freedom, right? Yeah.
they have freedom, they are in freedom,
Yeah.
and so kind of the way that I look at this, and Kierkegaard is really rather explicit about this, that he says that anxiety has this reflective quality. And I think what he means by that is, different emotions have kind of different aims, if you will. And so I think that emotions can have outward aims or inward aims. It's not a good or a bad thing. It's
Hmm.
just the way that they function. So, if I am walking down a sidewalk and I see somebody kick a dog, and that makes me angry, my anger there, it's not internally directed. It's externally directed to want. And I mean, I think that's a pure sense, one of the aims of anger is injustice and
Justice, right?
uh, the aim to sort of right a wrong in the world out there. And so anger's got this outward aim, but anxiety has this inward aim. And I think anybody that has experienced anxiety, this sort of anxiety that comes up out of nowhere, knows this
Mm,
very well. You're not trying to do anything out in the world.
right. Okay.
You immediately begin to introspect.
Hmm.
So it has this
Hmm.
reflective quality where there's something happening, but it's just doubling back in on you. Okay, and so the story that I see Kierkegaard telling here is yeah, Adam and Eve would have had anxiety, obviously, and he calls it an innocent anxiety, and he kind of compares it to the anxiety that children have when they're running out in the forest, he says, and there's this anxiety about the adventurous and the wondrous and the enigmatic, is what he says, and even the monstrous.
Hmm.
But it's like this exciting anxiety. That's the anxiety that he thinks that Adam and Eve have before the
Yeah.
fall. And so for them, uh, they perceive God's possibility, and naturally they just understand something exciting. God is inviting us to some new thing, and it's just natural. It's naturally understood. This is about God, because God is at the center of their lives here. So anxiety kind of perceives God's possibility, if you will, comes
Hmm.
back, reflects back in, and finds God, who's at the center of their lives. And of course, in the fall, Adam and Eve it's just the story of rebellion. It's the story of Adam and Eve rebelling against God and then running. They try to run from God. And so they've kind of kicked God out of their lives. God's no longer at the center of their lives. And interestingly,
Hmm.
I think again for Kierkegaard, of course, they still experience anxiety. It's a naturally God aimed thing. It would be actually it would be a shame, not just a shame, it would be extraordinarily detrimental to no longer feel anxiety because that's God's possibility. That is, as Kierkegaard says, freedom is always communicating. He's always communicating with us. God is always communicating with us. And so this is anxiety is sort of like our radio for picking up God's
God
possibilities. And
signals. Yes. Yeah.
yeah, and so but at this point after the fall, God's not at the center of their lives anymore. And so they still perceive God's possibility that manifests as anxiety. It reflects back in toward the
Hmm.
self, and it finds no longer God, but now it finds self. And so
Yeah.
Kierkegaard says
Yeah.
now anxiety becomes selfish.
Right.
And you see this in the garden. Immediately they experience shame, guilt, all kinds of, disordered uh, things that they wouldn't have been feeling if God was at the center of their lives. Um, and essentially, for Kierkegaard, this is what's passed on from Adam and Eve in a couple of different ways. Um, what's really fascinating about this notion is that if anxiety is about possibility, then every choice that we make, and this kind of presumes that choice requires possibility, but assuming that choice requires possibility, uh, then what this would mean is that some measure of anxiety would accompany choice.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about this
Mm.
too is that it's fascinating that Kierkegaard locates uh, what we've received from Adam and Eve sort of square in the middle of choice. Um, because anxiety, another way to look at anxiety is that it's, at least at a surface level, it's kind of the phenomenology or the feeling of freedom of the will. Um, so freedom
Yeah.
of the
Right.
freedom of the will is maintained here for Kierkegaard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's also right in there where our problem is. So every choice that we make is accompanied by anxiety. And if your anxiety is colored, if you will, towards selfishness or the self, then your choices are going to be colored for the self. Um, However, if your choices are aimed for God, then a sort of, you know, reborn or sanctified, the term that I use in my dissertation anyways, is sort of sanctified anxiety that's given through Christ, through forgiveness, through the work that
Mhm.
Christ has done on the cross. I mean, Christ redeems all things, including anxiety. Finally, anxiety it, it's able to be aimed properly again, um, and then your choices become colored for God. It-
Okay. I get a lot of things. I'm writing down possible articles to write. As you say these things, like things, just ideas are coming into my head. This is really good. Okay, I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. If
well,
you need to finish that thought.
this is actually one of the wonderful things about reading Kierkegaard. This is what
Yeah,
happens to me that I from the time I began reading Kierkegaard, that's exactly what happened to me.
yeah.
It's just like it's like
There,
you're playing in a sandbox, and just all of a sudden there's this explosion of new ideas that are not Kierkegaard's,
yeah.
and
It's almost anxiety, and some authors do that to you. And I know it's almost as a writer, it's almost anxiety because you read like half a page and then you'll have like three or four ideas for something that you want to write. You never finish
right,
the darn book because
right,
it takes 2 years to finish the book because every page is of Kierkegaard, you're like, oh, I gotta go,
right.
explore this and write my own thesis on it or something. But yeah,
And Kierkegaard actually called that. It turns out this was just my experience reading him. I didn't know
yeah,
that he did that on purpose. He did. That's what he wanted to happen to his readers, and he called that the indirect communication,
yeah,
which was kind of like I don't think that he ever put it exactly this way, but it's kind of like building a playground for the reader, and he's
yeah.
kind of setting boundaries. And those boundaries are uh, the Imago Christi, the image of Christ, and
Mhm.
Scripture. These are
Yeah,
these
yeah,
are the
yeah,
bounds,
yeah,
but
yeah.
there's this
Right.
huge sandbox to play in,
Yeah.
and he was kind of like, always, I don't want to just tell the reader what to think. I'm going to build this play area, and the reader is going to come out of it a different person.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
will have discovered things that I didn't know about, et cetera, et cetera.
yeah.
It's really
Those are
fascinating.
the best thinkers and writers do
Yeah.
that. Yeah. No, I was what was bouncing around in my head is connecting Kierkegaard's understanding of anxiety after the fall, turning in on itself, in curvatus. Um, have you ever read any of Rene Girard's theory of mimesis, mimetic violence?
No.
There's seems to be maybe something there that could be pursued because he's a substantive thinker and he's got this what is sort of a an attempt at a universal explanation for like all of human social interaction. This theory of mimesis, where we look out at uh, others, right, in an attempt to mimic, we idolize the other person who's also made in the image and likeness of God.
Hmm.
But it maybe relate to the anxiety that we have because we don't have the connection with God.
Hmm.
We're not seeing his process. We look at each other. We look at ourselves. We don't like what's there, so we got to look somewhere else. We
Mm.
can't look towards God possibilities. We need to look somewhere outside of our own self. So we look to others in the world,
Hmm.
right? And we see others who look successful or look like they have something we want. And then he talks about this triangle of mimetic desire. We start desiring what the other has. The other essentially becomes an idol for us, but then this eventually leads to conflict,
Mm.
right? Because then I need to sort of become uh, get what there has, and then this leads into his theory of scapegoat theory. Then ultimately you need sort of an innocent. It's convoluted, but there's something there in the with regards to the anxiety that we have as we experience ourselves, the
Hmm.
self orientation, the selfishness,
Yeah.
and then well, where else are we going to look to
Right.
have this anxiety relieved? We don't. God's out of the picture if we're still in our sins.
Hmm.
So then we start looking socially,
Yeah.
right? So I think that just interesting. There's something maybe there. You have to connect a few dots still, but yeah,
Yeah, actually, the dots are pretty close.
yeah,
So I
maybe,
mean,
maybe.
for one thing, Kierkegaard's book Practicing Christianity is about mimesis.
Okay,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but it's I mean it's influenced by Thomas A Kempis uh,
Mm.
imitation of
Imitatio
Christ.
Christi, yeah.
Yeah. Um, and interestingly, there for Kierkegaard, it's only he has this view of Christ as both prototype and redeemer. And what he means by that is you, so you're in a relationship with Christ and you have this desire to imitate Christ, our ideal.
Right.
Um, and then you fail and inevitably. And it's only in Christ. I mean, this is the only Christ says, "Come to me, all you who are burdened and heavy laden. I will give you rest for your souls." And so, you fail, and you're kind of on your knees, and Christ comes alongside you to give you rest, and He's like, "Take upon my yoke. Come next to me." The yoke always had two
Two.
spots,
Hmm.
and
Right.
Jesus is saying here, "Come take up the spot next to me, and let me do all the hard work." Um, and then you're back in this new cycle of being picked back up,
Yeah.
and aiming for Christ again, and then falling again. But for Kierkegaard, it's like this wheel that keeps you moving forward. And this is
Hmm.
kind of like the only this it's this unique example of the only figure, the only representation of God that is both prototype and redeemer in this way.
Hmm.
Um, and And it is. I mean, Matthew 11:28 figures into actually in a very deep way to all this, especially my experiences with anxiety. But I think partially Jesus is talking about anxiety there. Um,
And which passage in Matthew?
Matthew 11:28. Um, so
Okay. The yoke,
yeah, yeah,
coming
come to me, all you who are burdened and heavy
burdened.
laden, and yeah,
Yes.
and I,
Yes.
there's this there. this is the thing that, anxiety comes with weight.
Yeah.
Um, and sort of to pivot there for a second, another interesting thing about that weight is so going back to Kierkegaard's view of the aesthetic sphere,
Mm,
the aesthetic way of life. For Kierkegaard, he calls these light possibilities.
hmm
These are just possibilities that I conjure up out of my own imagination. But the reason he calls them light possibilities is because none of these possibilities are he says bent back onto themselves onto the self.
hmm
It's really just it's just fantasy. There's no ethical demands here.
Right.
There's the sort of the ultimate aesthete for Kierkegaard is not like
He's not like a pure hedonist, not like
no, he
Caligula or
has
something.
right, he
He
has
can be
very
very balanced. It's kind of
yeah,
balanced in his tastes and right
exactly.
and
Yeah,
desires and activities and everything, but
r- is an aesthete nonetheless.
is still in this. Yeah, I know people like this. I won't name names,
I
but I
think
know
we all
people
do.
like that.
Yeah.
They're not. I mean, yeah. And that is. I mean, that is the more sort of nuanced kind of hedonism of Epicurus as well.
Hmm. Right.
Otherwise, if we were the kind of aesthete that people think about when they just hear the term hedonism, we'd all just be whacked out on drugs on the street,
Right.
with riddled with disease. Right. But there's this almost like there's this aesthetic quality of creating an aesthetic life.
Right.
Like
Right.
there's almost like the aesthete who's like, carefully constructing this aesthetic lifestyle, which itself is sort of an aesthetic sort of project,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know.
And interestingly, Kierkegaard, so, the later existentialists would be sometimes characterized with the sort of catchphrase existence before essence, meaning
Sorry.
yeah, so which just means that um, you have to construct your own self.
You got to cobble
Um,
together your identity and your purpose
yeah,
in
and
the world.
interestingly, particularly in either or, Kierkegaard's either or, which are these really interesting letters. They're fictitious, but they're letters between an aesthete and a judge. Um, and what the judge ultimately tells the aesthete is that um, you must choose yourself absolutely. But what he means by that, and he says explicitly, is that you can only choose absolutely by accepting the self that God wants for you.
Mhm.
Um, so, so Kierkegaard essentially explicitly rejects that existence before essence. Um,
Yep.
you can only be your true self by resting, what he says, by resting transparently in God,
Mhm.
or being the self that
You can
God.
construct many false selves, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's what leads to despair,
Right, right, right.
which
That's
is
good. Yeah.
the grave sin. Um, but uh, but yeah, so I guess to go back, so there are a couple of senses in which this is what we received from Adam and Eve is this like distorted view of anxiety and a distorted understanding of it, and we just see it as problematic because we want to be Lord of our own lives, put it that
Right.
way.
Yeah.
Um, and what's, one of the things that I found particularly interesting about this is as I was, during this time, I was trying to think about, why do we see anxiety so negatively? Because at this point, I don't, and that's not to say because of anything great that I've done. I've just had these amazing
Mhm.
experiences with it.
Mhm.
Um, but what I've what I started meeting more and more people that have been through AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, which interestingly was started by a group of Christians in Oxford. Um,
Okay.
and so meeting more and more people that have been through it, and particularly th this really began with my cousin who was in and out of maximum security prisons his whole life. And um, he got to the point in his life where he was waking up and drinking liters of vodka
Mhm.
uh, throughout the whole day, and of course, had destroyed his life. And eventually, he reached out to me. This is after he had got out of maximum security prison. Said he wanted to meet,
Mhm.
and I met this guy, and it's just someone that I had never met. I mean, he
Totally
was a
different.
completely
Totally
different
different.
person.
Yeah.
And it turns out
Yeah.
that he had made it through AA, but when I met him, he was on this huge spiritual high,
Yeah.
where he for 2 weeks was like, I mean, God is right
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
And he's just speaking scripture, and he'd never read a verse of scripture.
Yeah. I know that. I know that that experience. Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. No, like I mean, and what's interesting. So okay, so interesting. Well, and we'll try and wrap up. But so when I had my conversion was so he was obviously he was an adult. What was he in his 30s or 40s when he
Yeah, probably 30s,
uh
and
got saved, right?
yeah. And there's an interesting leak to anxiety here, but I would love to hear your story.
Well, no, I just so after my conversion at 34, and given the things that I had, experienced in the past and done in the past, and it's like for I'd say several years, there's just this spiritual high that you're on.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, I must have read literally, I read through this little Bible that had been given to me, the whole thing in like maybe a couple weeks. And then I went out and bought a different translation and I
Wow.
read through that one. And then I went out and bought another. I mean, I must have read like just five or six different translations in the Bible, like all the
Wow.
way through in like, you know, 18 months or something.
Wow.
So I just couldn't get enough. I'm just reading, reading,
Yeah.
reading, and then not sitting there studying, and reading everything. Just you're just reading it,
Hmm.
and then there were just all kinds of things. And what was interesting is, I was on that Holy Spirit high for some time, even into my time in Afghanistan, which is another story for another day because I had some
Hmm.
interesting experiences. Where you're still on that spiritual high because I was still a new convert, basically. I was
Uh-huh.
still new in the Lord. But then I'm also in the middle of an actual physical battlefield as well.
Right.
Um, but when I got out to seminary at Talbot, um, like my third or fourth semester, second semester, I had a spiritual formation class with one of our theologians who's specialized in that area called by the name of John Coe.
Hmm.
Really smart guys, also got a PhD in philosophy. So he's just really, really smart, educated, great guy. And he started talking about how, and you don't know this before you study that, how, the spiritual theologians and John of the Cross and others, would speak about God giving the sinner a commensurate amount or quality of his spirit, commensurate to sort of the depth and intensity of the sin
Mm.
that they had come out of,
Mm.
because that person who had gone down sort of had more really embraced a certain sinful lifestyle. It's usually as is very much the case with addicts,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And they've really gone down a destructive path for a
Yeah.
long
Yeah.
time.
Uh-huh.
God, when they get saved, and this is also, I mean, even a greater example, this would be my pastor in Santa Fe Springs, who was in maximum security prison. He was a drug dealer and everything. So, I mean, when he gives his testimony, it's like, now it's 25 years after he was converted, but you get this dose of the Holy Spirit, to put it just simply,
Yeah.
um, in a way that nourishes you
Hmm.
spiritually because you were so depleted of God's
Hmm.
presence.
Hmm.
And I've had friends who've come out of paganism, the occult, and their conversions, the same thing, like just first year, they're just weeping, Like I
Yeah,
just
right,
cried for a year every
right.
time I walked into church or opened the
Yep.
Bible. I was just in tears
It's
and,
exactly what my cousin said.
yeah. So it's just interesting. So, I mean, talking about God meets you where you are is kind of how we put that, a
Right.
lot of times. But yeah, yeah, that's right. I get that a little bit.
Yeah. Um, well, what he eventually told me, so he's at this point, he finds he now, I mean, really, I mean, just in a pretty, pretty abrupt sense, is not only on the spiritual high, but is finding alcohol, just repulsive. I mean, the idea of it would make him want to
Mhm.
vomit.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so I was able to ask him, what have you been able to identify, what led you down that path? And he was like, well, absolutely. Yeah. Originally it was anxiety.
Mm.
And I was like, oh, really? Like,
Mm.
and he starts talking about it. It's the exact same thing that I
Wow.
experienced. And what he discovered, which was the same thing that I discovered in my first couple of years with it, was that alcohol would make it go away. Of course, you just have to keep upping the dose.
Yeah.
And so, um, and I asked him, I was like, well, so how many, how many people do you think are there in AA because of anxiety? And he said, I think just about all of
All
them.
of them.
And so to me, and then of course, um, the ones that's, I don't know if succeed is the right word, but the ones that make it through to the point where at least their anxiety is satisfied are the ones that come to a relationship with Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. That
Uh,
have a real conversion.
Right.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting about all that though is that I basically see the same thing there. I think like my cousin wouldn't have put it. He did say I'm very thankful for my anxiety. It ended up being I fought against it for so long, particularly because it just seems such a negative thing you're not supposed to
Right.
have. And um uh but if it weren't for that, I wouldn't have found Christ. My life wouldn't have been, it wouldn't be, he can't get enough of just helping other people now. It's like all that he lives for. And he's like, that would never be me if it weren't for
Wow.
anxiety and what God did through it. But so
Well, it kind
I,
of seems like too, like Kierkegaard comes around at the right time in history
right.
to sort
Yeah.
of put his finger on this.
Yeah.
Right, it is. It is interesting. I mean, another thing to
Yeah.
think about,
Yeah.
modernity, you know, right after the Enlightenment. We talk about the crisis of modernity. It's the crisis of authority. It's the crisis of metaphysics, a crisis of knowledge, all come in. It's interesting, and this is where he makes so many incredible insights
Yeah.
into this phenomenon, anxiety,
Yeah.
right? Because almost like he knows we're all gonna be dealing with this,
Right.
like in a more explicit way. Like not that it wasn't there in the past, but now maybe like in a more explicit way, like Kierkegaard is saying, this is going to be the sort of like the existential problem of our times.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I mean, nobody read the book when it came out. There were maybe I think there were maybe one or two reviews,
Yeah.
literature reviews on it. And
Well, and it
so,
didn't get translated into the German until I think after he was dead, right? Or
oh
any of
yeah,
his books. Because I don't know, we don't have time for this, but I don't know if like, you know, um, when you get to like Heidegger and he talks about angst, if that is also related to him picking up something in Kierkegaard, but I know he read Kierkegaard when it
yeah,
came out in the German, but
he did, and he said highly indebted to Kierkegaard.
yeah,
Uh, and at least as I read Heidegger, I I think I'll put it this way. I think a lot of times contemporary Kierkegaard scholars are reading Heidegger back into Kierkegaard. Um,
right.
I think Heidegger's got a completely different view of anxiety. It's
Yeah,
m more like our
he's got a
contemporary,
completely different
and
metaphysical
oh yeah,
metaphysics and
right,
theology.
right,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
yeah.
So
Um, but yeah, so I would sort of leave it with something like this. When I hear my cousin's story, when I meet somebody that is dealing with profound anxiety, for me, I mean, Kierkegaard says that anxiety is a very dangerous thing because, if you just grasp for finiteness, it's going
Mm.
to go wrong.
Yeah.
But that's not the aim of anxiety. The aim of anxiety is God, what God is inviting you to. And so for me, the person that is experiencing anxiety and the deeper, the better. I mean, this is exactly what Kierkegaard says. He says, someone will say to me, but I don't experience anxiety. And Kierkegaard says, well, I will say that you're a very spiritless person.
Mhm. Right.
So,
Right. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so the more profound the anxiety, I think,
The greater the
um,
opportunity, or the more like,
the bigger the calling that God
is
has
there.
for this person.
Yeah.
And so this person is on the cusp of something amazing. This is my view. This is my experience with anxiety. And so in a sense, it's very sad how prevalent anxiety is today without, um, you know, what I think is a proper approach to it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it also means that there's something very spiritually interesting happening at the same time. And I wonder, like I say, the most incredible things in my life have happened through anxiety. Um, Having understood anxiety as a God-aimed thing.
Mhm.
I I truly can't imagine what the world would look like if everyone that experienced anxiety looked at it as a divine invitation. I think the world, even if a small percentage of people did that, I think the world would be just exploding with people doing the most amazing things that they can't do.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, might put a lot of therapists out of work, but oh
Or change
well.
the way that they approach it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, Brent, this has been it's going to be one of my favorite episodes. I have to tell you.
Thank you.
I mean, it's just done a perfect job of doing some very interesting philosophical work, but that's not hanging out in the abstract
Yeah.
and is really uh, relevant and need to be make people aware of what Kierkegaard is saying here because it really can change our whole perspective on the phenomenon of anxiety. So it's been awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
thanks for
Thanks for
coming on
having
the
me.
podcast. And well, we mentioned a bunch of other things too. We'll have to touch on in later episodes. So
Would love to.
all right, brother. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks
God
for
bless.
having me. God bless.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909-493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.